Hey, it's Mazzy. Psychedelic San Francisco, the debut albums. This is a topic I've revisited frequently to various formats and things. And let me give you a little warning first, okay? I'm going to showcase the debut albums of the Summer of Love. Actually, prior to the Summer of Love, 1966 to 1969, that golden period of the sounds of San Francisco on and before and after the Summer of Love, 1967. Great name that the press pretty much gave it, Ralph J. Gleason and many others. Ralph J. Gleason was the wonderful columnist for the San Francisco Chronicles, an amazing jazz critic. Read his articles. He wrote about jazz, but he was the one that really pushed and pioneered the San Francisco bands like the Grateful Dead and the Jefferson Airplane and others, and the ballroom scenes that Chet Helms and Bill Graham produced at the Avalon, the Fillmore, and in Golden Gate Park, and so many other areas. Clubs like the Matrix, and later Friends and Relations and the Family Dog, and on and on and on and on. I am sure that I will be repeating things I've told, so if you are a frequent viewer of this channel, I am not senile, but when I put these packages together, or these videos together, I should say, I'm not going to assume that everyone has heard me say these things. And these are historic facts and personal stories that I merge into the music, into the records that came out. And of course, 1967, the end of the Summer of Love in September in San Francisco, is when I was bar mitzvah, turning 13 in late August. So think about this, 12, 13, 14, into being 15 years old, these records came out. I bought every single record here as they came out or within months. In those days, you didn't know about release dates. At least nobody I knew about release dates, except we heard about these albums. So I'm going to go through the debut albums of the main core bands, how I see the main core. Now, there are offshoot bands like Hot Tuna I'm not including. They just got in the wire in 1969. And I'm not including the Beau Brummels. Came out late 1964, kind of a follow or answer to the Beatles out of San Francisco with Laugh Laugh. And they did some psychedelic music, but their music predates this really psychedelic thing. It was a different really scene then. So, and there's bands like Mother Earth from Northern California, or at least out in Marin and Northern country rootsy, great band with Tracy Nelson. And there are others, too many. And then what about the garage rock bands out of the South Bay, okay? See what I'm getting at here? But these are the ones that I grew up with, that I got as they came out, not a definitive list of everything San Francisco. And I just want to go through the first albums. Of course, in 1966, RCA comes and hears about these bands in San Francisco, and they sign the Jefferson Airplane. Now, this there's probably two records here, maybe three, that are not so psychedelic, and this is one of them. This is a true folk rock record. This is the first Jefferson Airplane album, 1966, but recorded in Hollywood when those recording engineers in the studios really were unfamiliar with loud rock and roll bands, but they still had some acoustic elements here with electric, obviously. You know the band, but here is Signe Anderson, the lead singer of the band at the time. After this, she would have a child, move out of San Francisco, and Grace Lick would replace her. But this is a real, true, wonderful folk rock record. It's no secret was played on local radio. I don't know how much beyond, but they did some staples like Tobacco Road. Oh, Come Up the Years, another song that got a lot of radio play, locally at least. This was really Marty Ballin's group to start. And of course, you get Jack Cassidy and Jorma Kakkonen, two friends. You get Paul Kantner, who became one of the main writers in the band as well, and a wonderful Spencer Dryden on drums. So Ralph J. Gleason writes the liner notes on this album. Fantastic album. And of course, we know they become more psychedelic. And once they hit big in 1967, after Surrealistic Pillow, all the labels came scrambling to San Francisco for the San Francisco sound. This is a unique piece because they never really recorded and released in the true sense. The Great Society, of course, this is a one of many reissues of The Great Society featuring Grace Slick. It was obviously put out, I think the first version Columbia put out in 1968 as a response to the popularity of the Jefferson Airplane and especially Grace Slick. And this is the band Grace Slick was in prior to joining the Airplane. And this is where the two songs, White Rabbit and Somebody to Love, come from. There's different versions on this, a little more folky, a little more slow, not as powerful and in your face as what she would record with the Airplane. Those versions are kind of the definitive versions, but there's a sort of Eastern sound. There's a certain, the musicianship is cool and calm, and maybe one would say light. But this is a cool record, and it's a great archival piece of music. So recorded in 66, didn't see the light of day, at least to most of us, until 1968. Grace Slick and the Great Society, of course. She was married to Darby Slick, so Darby and his brother were in the band with her here. Great Society on Columbia. And of course, the debut Grateful Dead album recorded in 1967 with that great opening track, the Golden Road of Unlimited Devotion. I was homesick. My mother said, "I'm going to the store. Is there anything you want?" How about a record? She went to the record store. What record? I wanted the Grateful Dead record. I'd heard about the Dead. I'd seen the posters around. I'd read about them. I heard that song. FM radio was just starting in San Francisco with KMPX. And when she heard me say the name, she kind of smiled, as I recall. But she brought this copy home. She brought a stereo copy home to me, the Grateful Dead's debut. Then there's Big Brother and the Holding Company. This happens to be a Sunday's reissue of the mono version. They were signed to a small label that I had never heard of. Of course, I was really just getting into labels in the mid-'60s and knowing about, obviously, Columbia and Capitol because of my favorite artists, the Byrds, Dylan, the Beatles, and the Kinks. Well, that was Reprise. But Big Red and the Holding Company featuring Janis Joplin. Down on Me was the song that we all heard. Small label, mainstream was, of course, after they played the Monterey Jazz Festival, Clive Davis snapped them up and bought out their contract, and they were on Columbia with Cheap Thrills. But this is a cool record, and my junior high school band covered several songs on this. Light is Faster Than Sound, a Peter Alban song. We did Blind Man, a song credited to all the group. I love that song. And we did Caterpillar, another Peter Alban. We basically did most of the songs that Janis didn't sing lead vocals. We weren't going to attack that. But this is a fantastic record, 1967, the debut album by Big Brother and the Holding Company. Now, one of the greatest bands that should have been bigger, and won't get into the whole massive story, but that is Moby Grape, produced by David Rubinson, who was a famed producer in San Francisco. This is their debut album, and the song Omaha should have been a hit. Columbia releases 5 singles at once on this publicity blitz stunt, and it really kind of ruined the group. In those days, you needed to kind of let the radio players and the program directors and the music directors know what to play, or suggest at least, and you release 5 songs at once. You're screwed. What are they going to play? You're not going to have a hit. 805 is a beautiful folk song. Now, this is a real mixed record. It's psychedelic at times, but it's a little more psychedelic on hyperdrive at times. There's some country influences. Of course, the cover photograph, famous cover photograph by Jim Marshall, and you have him flipping the bird there. Later, it was retouched out, as you can see on that copy. But you got your wonderful shot at the Fillmore Auditorium there, or is it the Avalon? I think it's the Fillmore. Photos by Jim Marshall. I love that. And of course, it came with that great poster. And I had a version of this up in my room back in 1967. I don't think my parents ever noticed it, but they were so cool. They wouldn't have cared, really, you know. I was a good kid. Now, this is an album that stands out because it's one of, again, 2 or 3 records that's nothing like the real psychedelic scene, the ballroom scene. And they were kind of considered one-hit wonders, but they played the ballrooms, and that was Sop with Camel from the East Bay and Marin. They were almost like a vaudevillian rock band, a way also a jug band in a way, the Love and Spoonful, but didn't have all the great songs. Of course, they did have a huge radio hit, and probably the first radio hit. This is 1967, so with the Jefferson Airplane, I don't remember the exact dates, but Hello, Hello. Won't you have some of my tangerine? I just love this whole record. It's sort of Baroque, psychedelic pop music. And that was it, done. Until 1974, where they kind of regrouped and they did the Miraculous Hump Returns, which is a really good album. It's got a little of this sound, but it's got a little more proggy, light prog, folky sense. And it's a cool album. It was on Warner Reprise, I believe. But I was at a photo shoot that my photographer Michelle Clement did in the late 80s, early 90s. Where Are They Now for Rolling Stone? And it was the entire group came. They're doing different things then, and we spent the entire day with them. And they were jamming for the first time in years on this huge permanently parked ship in Sausalito. And it was so cool because I knew them. And anyway, that was a fun story, fun day, I remember. And I don't know, you can look in the archives for Where Are They Now, Sop with Camel, photographed by Michelle Clement. And in 1968, the debut by Creedence Clearwater Revival. They had been called the Gollywogs. They were signed to Fantasy Records. And this blew everything away in terms of sales. And of course, they would become this massive hit maker. This is 1968. And then, of course, in 69, they released, 3 albums, all hits? From El Cerrito, California, which is just slightly north of Berkeley, California, across the bay from San Francisco. This was a monster hit. There was something called the San Francisco International Pop Festival in October of 1968 in Alameda, which is the island, naval base island across in the East Bay, between San Francisco and Oakland there. And there was a festival there at this racetrack, and my friend's father brought us to it both days, and I saw Creedence Clearwater, Deep Purple in 68 when Hush came out. But this was a highlight of that day. So many acts over 2 days. What a memory. Of course, Susie Q was the song that really kind of brought us in to this record from the FM radio KMPX again. I Put a Spell on You, 99.5 Won't Do. Amazing record. All the records are great. I'm always partial to this because of the memories and hearing them first and having that, you never thought this band was from the Bay Area. They sound like swampy, Louisiana or the southern type of music. But East Bay natives, East Bay band. What a debut album. Now in 1968, I remember there was one of the record stores I used to go to quite a bit, was called Portals to Music in Stonestown Mall Shopping Center, which is right adjacent to San Francisco State College. And they had listening booths in the back. And I would go there every once in a while. I told the story before that I bought Tommy there the first time because the guy selling it to me told me, you got to get this record and you got to go see them. So I went to see The Who perform Tommy. And that was a fellow named Roy Loney. I'm going to show one of his records later here. I didn't know at the time that he was a member of the Flaming Groovies, and later, well, we'll get to that story. But I remember walking by in the window in the mall one day, and they had obviously a Capitol Records display of these 2 records. They came out months apart. But the debut Quicksilver Messenger Service and the debut Steve Miller Band. Let me start with this record. I absolutely love this record. I did a video, you can seek it out, of the first 5 Steve Miller Band albums, which I think are masterpieces. I prefer those. I'm glad he got famous and sold records finally after, The Joker and Fly Like an Eagle. 3/4 Stratocaster chords, great double tracking. I get it. I love it. He came from Texas with Boz Scaggs, and Boz Scaggs is on these 2 albums as well. The first 2 albums, this, and the second album, Sailor, on Capitol Records. The first, I think, all 5 records were produced by Glenn Johns, the first couple in London for a lot of money, apparently. And he negotiated some huge, massive, either advance or like a 5 or 6 album deal. And he didn't really sell a lot. But I love the psychedelicness of this, the bluesy psychedelicness of this cover and this album and the music on here. Children of the Future is a great opening on here, but it's got sort of sound effects, like very, it just really has an interesting sound. It's a sexy bluesy psychedelic album, atmospheric at times, but then it gets into some wonderful blues, upbeat tempo thing, like You've Got the Power, Baby's Calling Me Home, the great, almost like Baroque pop song, written and sung by Boz Scaggs with that, I think, harpsichord on it as well. Steppin' Stone, not the Steppin' Stone you may know from Paul Revere and the Monkees. Just a really, really great debut album. And again, as I said, watch the video of the first 5 albums of the Steve Miller Band. Tim Turner also, Lonnie Turner on here as well, and Tim Davis, and Jim Peterman was in the group to begin with, but Steve Miller Band. They were called the Steve Miller Blues Band prior to them recording. And of course, this album. This, to me, is a perfect album, and it's a really unique sounding album. The vocals, the double dueling guitars by Gary Duncan and John Cipollina just make this band something special. I've always been a fan of their first 2 albums, especially. Dino Valenti was in the band, went to jail, to prison for some years, came back, and that's when later you got their hits, actually. They got hits when he came back with Have Another Hit of Fresh Air. But that atmospheric, reverberation type of music didn't get me as much. I think they lost something. This record isn't reverb drenched. It's the Cipollina's guitar and Duncan's guitar. Cipollina especially has this alligator type sound on here on his SG that is like nobody else I've ever heard. And I have seen Quicksilver with him. He was also, later he would be in a band, one album called Copperhead, and that great live album with Man Band, the Welsh band, live. But this album opens up with a Hamilton Camp folk singer song called Pride of Man. Again, another song our band would cover on this. And Gold and Silver, and of course this great masterpiece in a way, Psychedelic Symphonia without strings in a way. Well, are there strings on that? Maybe I'm thinking that there might have been. But The Fool that ends the album, and his guitar leads on that is, and the melodies segmented in there is just a fabulous album. And of course, this foil cover and that just killer cover by Rick Griffin, one of the poster artists of the Fillmore and Avalon scene back in the 1960s. But this is a special record to me. But I just can still see that entire huge window at the mall with just these 2 covers. They must have had like 30 of each, just, a huge window. And that was a great thing. I wish I had a picture of that. Debut albums. Now, this is out of the blue, literally, Blue Cheer, 1968, 1969, I believe. This was so different. This, some people contribute this or blame or give credit to this being sort of the beginning of heavy metal. And it is that power trio to the hilt, loud. Of course, it got radio airplay, had a hit with Summertime Blues, the Eddie Cochran song. It just blasted. Again, our band covered another song here called Out of Focus. We did in sort of an instrumental version, which, anyway, cool song, a lot of fuzz, a lot of volume, just an intense record. This, on Philips Records. I love that it's embossed. Just a wonderful record. Wonderful, really, really wonderful record. Blue Cheer. Blue Cheer is. Look it up if you don't. Okay. It's a beautiful day. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole business side of things with Moby Grape and It's a Beautiful Day and their manager. That's a story seek out, and it's kind of tragic that the manager owns the name of these two groups, took it away from the artistes and the musicians. Horrible. This, another album that got a lot of airplay, at least on the West Coast, and I'm sure in FM radio, is Whitebird. David LaFlame, they had the benefit or the introduction of having, or the difference, I guess I should say, he's a violinist. And aside from Sid Page with Dan Hicks and his Hot Licks, I did not include them in this either. But those are the only two bands I recall that had violins in the ensemble there. But this is a beautiful record, a little more folky based, very almost Marin County. Those of you outside of the Bay Area don't know what that means. It's getting out of the city, a little more country, a little more, back earthy, I should say, earthy, rather than urban city, Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco, Golden Gate Park. They seem to have that sound, but I love this cover. I mean, this cover and the second Quicksilver with the Happy Trails might be the same. I think it was Globe Propaganda. Globe Propaganda was the art studio that did these two covers, as I recall. But this self-produced by David LaFlame. It's a Beautiful Day. Years later, David LaFlame would put out an album called Whitebird. He took back the song, he re-recorded it because he couldn't put the name It's a Beautiful Day. But there's a David LaFlame, actually a pretty good record, and he re-records a version of Whitebird. This, it's funny, and I know someone's going to say, Mazzy likes everything. This music is so dear to me and so a part of my growing up. There was the Beatles, the Byrds, Dylan, obviously the garage rock stuff, and the Summer of Love, the sounds of San Francisco. Of course, I liked East Coast bands, but that's for another day, another video, right? But this stuff, I could see these bands. I could see them play in the park. I could see them for free, and then eventually see them in the ballrooms as well. Sons of Champlin, Loosen Up Naturally, a 1968 double album, horn-heavy vibe playing, jazzy fusion psychedelic band, funky a little bit. This came out the same year as the first Chicago Trans Authority, another horn-based band. That band went on to superstardom. They didn't. But Bill Champlin, ironically, would go, 10 years later and join Chicago. I was not into Chicago then. To me, that's their MOR years in a way. But this album is so good. Find this album. There's a whole story about the cover. They scratched off because they wrote fuck somewhere and it's whited out. I forgot which one's which. I have a couple copies of this. Capitol Records, another great Capitol. Capitol got Steve Miller, Sons of Champlin, Quicksilver. They did a second album they put out under the name Sons, and then they changed the name to Yogi Phlegm, and then back to the Sons. They kind of messed up, but they were so good live. Now, on here, there's some long, jammy songs. There's some funky things. There is a song called Get High with this great vibraphone solo throughout, and gets really ethereal there. And Freedom it takes up entire side 4 on this. But what a wonderful album this is. This is a record that I put on and I just blast it. I turn it up to 11, or I don't really. I don't want to blow up my Hegel H390. 1969. Okay, everyone always talks about Abraxas, fantastic album, of course. But this album also, this was a game changer too. That Latin influence of Carlos Santana growing up or living in the Mission District. Kids on the peninsula get in this band as well. Half Latino, half Caucasian. You got Michael Shreve. Of course, this album was again, another David Rubinson production, managed by Bill Graham. Exploded for them once the 1970 Woodstock film came out, especially with that great guitar, that just snarling guitar of Carlos, and that drum sequence, that amazing drum solo and playing, triple screen, split screen in 3 of Michael Shreve. And Michael Shreve used to always come in the record store. He lived near us in the record factory. He lives up here in the Seattle area now for the last, I don't know, 25, 30 years. But this is great. I mean, you got the Kungas, you got Jose Chapito Arias and Michael Carabella. Of course, you got Greg Raleigh, you know, we know Journey fame, but this cover, this wonderful cover art as well by Lee Conklin. What a great, that was used as a poster. I can't remember if it was created for the poster or the album, but what a debut album. You got Tito Puente songs in it. You got Evil Ways, you got Jingo. Soul Sacrifice was that song from Woodstock that just blew the house down. One of the greatest performances from that film. Santana debut. And last but not least, the Flamin' Groovies debut album, Super Snaz, which came out on Epic Records. They were a very different band from everyone else. They were sort of a retro band. They did almost like rockabilly, rock and roll, proto-punk, you might say, at times. Roy Looney was the main singer here, and I mentioned him because he worked at Portals to Music. Ironically, after meeting him then, years later, we worked together at ABC Records. He was a promo guy in 78, 79 at ABC Records. A quiet guy, but then he regrouped and started a band called the Phantom Movers, Roy Looney and the Phantom Movers. He died a couple of years ago, unfortunately. But this is a cool record. This is a very different record. This does not fit in on what the cliche of the San Francisco sound is, really. You know, when they talk about that, they never bring up the Flamin' Groovies. Of course, then in the 1970s, they regrouped without Roy Looney, and they became a very different band. They were on Sire Records, and they produced, 3 really good albums, but they were sort of that Merseyside sound, jingle jangle, Birdsley, 12-string, like, harmony bands, covering some Byrds, covering some very early Beatles, not psychedelic at all, but in that jingle jangle way, as I said, influencing bands later like REM and, Jayhawks, things like that, possibly. But Super Snaz is a debut album. Again, it's like no other that I showed today. So these are the records. These are the debuts of the sounds of San Francisco in the late 1960s. Thanks for watching. I know I miss someone, and you're going to tell me below. But that's what I love about you. And that's what Mazzy loves about you. Thank you.